Marvel and DC, Peter Parker's brother becomes the strongest hero across the multiverse. Episode 71. Good and Evil? Peter broke the promise. He was originally shopping with Mary Jane when he saw a police car chasing the Sandman who had just robbed him. He unconsciously made an excuse with Jane, and then chased after her. Sandman's ability is very special, he can completely turn his body into sand. Therefore, whether it is bullets or other physical attacks, it is difficult to cause damage to Sandman. At this time, Marco was driving a stolen car and driving wildly on the street. On the passenger seat was a travel bag of huge amounts, which was bulging with banknotes. Behind him, several police cars were reluctantly following. However, Sandman has the ability to transform into sand and is not afraid of crashing. Therefore, he drove very fast and ran rampant. "Chief, our car can't catch up with him." Outside a car on the roadside, Chief George Stacy frowned after receiving the report from his subordinates. The other party is suspected to be a person with super ability and is not afraid of getting hurt at all. "My subordinates are all made of flesh and blood, how can they compare with him? What's more, there are so many civilians on the street, and it's impossible for their police cars to ignore the lives of these ordinary people." Just when George was still worried, there was a sudden howling sound of wind flying past his head. George looked up. Under the illumination of street lamps and lights from nearby buildings, a figure wearing a black, white, and pink spider suit swayed by. "It's Spider-Woman." On the street, pedestrians immediately shouted loudly. Although Iron Man is more famous, Spider-Man and Spider-Woman are closer to the lives of ordinary people like them. The police officers were about to cheer together, but suddenly they saw Director George standing next to them. Suddenly, the police officers fell silent. Everyone knows that Director George hates criminals, but he also hates Spider-Man and Spider-Woman. Using lynching to uphold justice is also a crime in George's eyes. But, what he didn't know was, the Spider-Woman who has been giving him a headache is actually his baby daughter, Gwen Stacy. Looking at his silent men, George knew what they were thinking. But there is no way. The criminals appearing in New York today are more and more outrageous. It is indeed difficult for ordinary people like them to handle it. So, George could only helplessly say, "What are you looking at me for?" Getting ready for the finishing touches. As soon as he finished speaking, another black and red figure whizzed past him. Spider-Man, Peter, arrives on the scene. Gwen's is more agile and faster. Therefore, she reached above Sandman first. The spider silk launcher in her right hand shot out spider silk at the road sign ahead. After Gwen swayed, she fell diagonally towards the roof of the Sandman car. Bang! While driving, Sandman was startled by a sound coming from the roof of the car. Then, Gwen appeared from the car window hanging upside down. "Stop now." However, Sandman naturally cannot be captured without mercy. Regarding the two Spider-Men in New York, he has already thought about it clearly and is ready for a confrontation. Turning a corner, the car came to a construction site. Sandman's appearance begins to transform, and countless amounts of sand begin to appear. Bang! The car was instantly pushed open, and the Sandman form appeared. A large amount of sand formed a human shape, condensing the appearance of Marco. With a slight flick, the travel bag containing a large amount of banknotes was swallowed by his sand-turned body. In this form, Marco is almost not afraid of any physical attacks. However, at this time, he had just been released from prison, and he actually had the idea of correcting his evil ways and returning to righteousness. So, looking at Spider-Woman who was eyeing him eagerly, he lowered his head and begged. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone. My daughter is sick and needs a lot of money for treatment. Please." Marco's past was definitely not a good person. But at this moment, he is indeed a father who is in danger again for his daughter. Gwen was soft-hearted. Listening to Marco's begging, she was stunned for a moment. Because she didn't know whether she should catch the other person or let him go at this time. According to Gwen's usual style, she will never let the criminal go. But if Marco is caught, it will be equivalent to sentencing his daughter to death. To be honest, this choice is still too difficult for Gwen. Seeing that Gwen seemed to be persuaded by him, Marco nodded gratefully. "Thanks." Marco really didn't want to conflict with Gwen if it wasn't necessary. "Great, with all this money, wait for Daddy." A smile appeared on Marco's face, and he was ready to rush to his daughter as soon as possible. It was at this time that Peter arrived. Looking at Sandman who was about to leave, although Peter didn't understand why Gwen stood aside, he still stretched out his hand and shot out the spider silk. He caught a stone on the side of the road and threw it at Sandman's head. Physical attacks of this level have no effect on Marco, who is completely deserted. I saw that after the stone pillar submerged into Sandman's body, it bounced out on the other side. Marco turned around and saw another Spider-Man. But, why is this male Spider-Man different from the one he saw on TV? On Peter's spider suit, the top should originally be red with black lines. But at this time, the color of his shirt was completely different, turning mostly black. Obviously, the black symbiote has begun to parasitize Peter, but Peter himself is not aware of it yet. I have no intention of being your enemy. Marco looked at Spider-Man, who was obviously much stronger than Spider-Woman, and quickly explained his motive for robbing the money. However, Peter didn't care about that at this time. So what? If you want to save your daughter, then why not steal other people's money? Perhaps, among this money, there is money to save other people's lives? Of course, the money is actually the bank's money, but the loss is not personal. But Peter didn't care about that much at this time. In other words, he has changed from being brainless and kind-hearted before to now knowing how to think. Listening to Peter's words, Marco was silent for a few seconds. He had no reason to refute. Then we have nothing to say. His voice was deep. No matter what, even if it means sacrificing the interests of others, you must keep your daughter. For this, no matter how much you pay, you won't hesitate. Marco raised huge amounts of sand fist, hitting Peter from top to bottom. In order to take the money back smoothly, he had to solve the immediate trouble first. Looking at the huge amounts of fists above his head, Peter stretched out his right hand, and the spider silk directly wrapped around the wall beside him. Just as Peter was about to pull himself away, a stream of sand rose up from the ground and pulled Peter directly from below. Boom! With one punch, Peter fell directly to the ground, letting out huge amounts of roar. Episode 72. The end. During this period, Peter's strength was far from reaching its peak. Therefore, given Sandman's nearly invincible physical defense, it is difficult for Peter to cause any harm to him. Of course, Peter's physical fitness is also quite strong. Jumping out of the pile of sand, Peter spit out a mouthful of sand. Bah! Bah! This blow aroused the anger in Peter's heart. Black liquid spread over his body. Soon, his spider suit turned completely black. Whoosh! A black thread shot out from Peter's wrist. Obviously, this is with the power of the black symbiote. However, as mentioned just now, ordinary physical attacks have little effect on Sandman. After cutting Sandman's body, the black spider silk stuck to the wall behind. I don't want to be your enemy. Stop forcing me. Marco's tone was already a little impatient. Since being released from prison, he has vowed to become a good person again. This time, after saving his daughter, he will stop. Peter. Gwen hung herself upside down with spider silk. She didn't know what to do, so she just watched. However, she clearly saw something strange about Peter. There's something wrong with you. What was that? The venom that was on Thompson's body back then? Gwen remembered that Luya once called this black liquid that way. In fact, the symbiote on Peter's body came from the venom on Thompson's body. At that time, following Thompson's venom and starving, he almost thought he was going to starve to death. So, it split itself. That's what Peter has now. However, Peter didn't seem to agree with Gwen's statement. No. I am fine. I can feel the power it gives me. Peter seems to be very conscious. What is he doing? On his shoulder, a black ferocious head suddenly appeared. Yes, this woman is driving a wedge between us. Shadow poison. And you, Peter. We are the most perfect existence. After saying that, Shadow Poison's head disappeared and turned back into black liquid covering the surface of the spider suit. Peter waved his arms twice, and he could feel that the Shadow Poison almost doubled his strength. Turning to stare at Sandman, Peter smiled evilly, in his opinion. Be obedient and submit to the law. As he spoke, the spider silk from his hands shot out, and his arms exerted force. Using the elasticity of the spider silk, Peter used it as a cannonball and shot at Sandman at extremely high speeds. Watching Peter turn around and deal with Sandman again, Gwen also became puzzled. Maybe he was affected by the Shadow Poison, but he still insists on fighting criminals. Let's just say he wasn't affected. His behavior was so weird. While Gwen was still confused, a black figure flew backwards from her at a faster speed. Rubbing the construction site garbage on the ground, Peter coughed and got up again. He overestimated the effect of Shadow Poison on him. After not eating for too long, not even chocolate, Shadow Poison was already quite weak. Peter looked up, and a dark shadow enveloped him. Sandman condenses the sand from his body into shape, doubling his power. If this punch had hit him, Peter would have been injured at the very least. However, halfway through the landing of huge amounts of hardened sand fist, Marco felt something was wrong. His fist was thrust into the air. What situation? He turned around and saw a young man with blonde hair. And he focused on analyzing the super ability person here in New York, and his appearance completely matched the characteristics of a patriot. Enough. Luya raised his head and gave a gentle push. Marco's sand-transformed body went back more than a dozen steps with a dong-dong-dong-dong sound, and then somersaulted and fell to the ground. Glancing at his brother Peter, Luya made a verdict for tonight's battle. This farce ends here. Seeing the arrival of the lure, Gwen breathed a sigh of relief. At the very least, you don't have to think about the next thing. The only pity is. Sandman looked at him with some pity. I'm afraid it will be difficult for this guy to come out of here intact again tonight. You don't have to worry about it. I can handle it myself. Peter on the ground was still arrogant. He just doesn't want to admit now that his brother is worse than Luya. On Marco's side, feeling the trembling from his arms, he knew that things might be serious today. I just want treatment for my daughter. You. Before he could finish speaking, Luya glanced at him. Did I tell you not to treat your daughter? Well? Marco was confused. Let's go. Before I change my mind. To release or not to release is just a matter of thought for Luya. Marco should be glad that he did it for his daughter and his relatives. Otherwise, he might have become a glass man by now. What else does Peter want to refute? However, the awe deep in his heart made him shut up. Yes, Peter discovered now that he was actually quite in awe of his brother Luya in his heart. Just as Luya said, this farce is over. Peter's failure to make an appointment forced Mary Jane to go home alone. At the same time, her impression of Peter gained an unreliable label. When he returned home, Peter had already put on his coat and covered up the black Spider-Man suit. Oh Peter, you're finally back. Your uncle and I are both worried about you. May opened the door and saw her nephew Peter coming back. She asked with concern about Peter's afternoon. However, Peter was in a very bad mood at this time. Therefore, facing Aunt May's concern, he said nothing and just wanted to return to the room quickly. Peter. Ben spoke. I think you should tell us what happened today. Peter's condition was obviously not right, and I planned to have a good talk with him. No. I'm very nice, and I don't have anything to say to you. In the past, Peter would never have said such a thing. However, due to his emotional instability at this time and the influence of shadow poison, he still said this. After saying these words, Peter went upstairs without looking back. Only May and Ben were left stunned. God, I can't believe this is coming out of Peter's mouth. May touched her silver hair, sadly. This was the first time Peter said harsh words. Don't take it too seriously. Seeing his wife's sad look, although Ben was also uncomfortable with Peter's change, he still comforted him. Young people always go through a rebellious phase, don't they? I'll go have a nice talk with him. After comforting his wife, Ben walked towards Peter's room. Episode 73. The arrival of the god of trickery. I'm back. Luya opened the door and found that his parents' expression seemed a little bad. After a simple statement from his mother May, Luya learned what happened and their worries. Okay, I'll talk to him properly. In fact, Luya just wants Peter to be more decisive and make decisions faster. Now it seems that the goal has been achieved. Then, it's time for him to wake up. The next morning, Peter was back to his usual humility. Of course, compared to before, he may not be so hesitant in his heart. Son, I never thought that you were good at talking to people. Thank you for the compliment. Luya deliberately accepted his father's praise with a very proud expression. Really good at it. Last night, Peter was beaten violently by him, even with the shadow poison. He repeatedly begged for mercy and promised not to influence Peter unduly. Would you say something like this yourself? Green eyes, dark green and gold armor. Holding a scepter with a yellow gemstone. Loki, who is now the god of trickery, looked at the Chitauri scepter in his hand, and the smile on his face could not be stopped no matter what. He knew that Thanos had ulterior motives in giving this scepter to him. But Loki didn't care. What does it matter? I just want to prove my ability in front of my eccentric father, Odin. Look towards the distant depths of the universe, where the Earth is. You mean, Fury still wants to persuade me to join SHIELD? Looking at the man with a curvy but standing in front of him, Luya felt a little funny. Unexpectedly, Captain America became a veteran of the Avengers without Stark joining them. After experiencing initial confusion, Steve Rogers chose to continue fighting after being persuaded by Fury. However, this time, his choice is no longer for politicians, but for the future of mankind. Patted Rogers' chest. Well, it feels really good. No. Luya asked back. Then why don't you come and join me instead, Captain Rogers? Regarding Luya's question, Rogers just thought about it briefly and continued. After all, SHIELD is professional, isn't it? There are professional talents here who can formulate various effective plans. You are right. Luya continued to question. However, according to your own statement, can we defeat the alien invasion by formulating a plan? Luya always believes that strength determines everything. For example, facing Thanos, who is at the level of Sub-Heavenly Father, humans have no weapons at all that can punish him. Like in the movie, if you succeed in defeating the superior through a series of plans, you may only have one chance. However, there are countless multi-universes. Do you want to bet on that pitiful opportunity that doesn't even count? Absolutely impossible. Of course, Luya does not exclude cooperation with S.H.I.E.L.D. Although SHIELD is currently facing internal and external troubles, Hydra, Rogers is right about one thing. That is, various technologies of SHIELD are still used by myself, especially the monitoring system. Before the Superman template reaches a certain level, his brain cannot accept the massive feedback brought by supervision and superhearing for a long time. We can cooperate when necessary. Luya gave advice. As a representative of S.H.I.E.L.D., Rogers knew that this might be the best outcome he could talk about. Then, happy cooperation. Just as the two reached an agreement, Rogers' cell phone suddenly rang. At the same time, the communicator on Luya's wrist also received Stark's call. Holding a scepter and wearing a golden-green armor? Loki? Stark recounted what had just happened. The hypercube was taken away by him? Rogers is also communicating with Fury. Luya suddenly realized that he seemed to have forgotten something. Hypercube. Isn't that a tesseract? A container to hold space gems. Damn it. I actually forgot such an important point. Since Loki has come to Earth, it means that he has obtained the scepter given to him by Thanos. The Chitauri scepter is inlaid with the Mind Stone. Plus the space gems in Tesseract. In other words, Loki has already collected 2 Infinity Stones at this time. Loki's current stage is originally a strength above the planet level, plus the blessing of 2 infinite gems. Fortunately, Loki is definitely quite new to using the Infinity Stones. Otherwise, he should have reached the Heavenly Father level by now and have the strength to destroy stars. Looking at the expressionless Lua, Rogers smiled and said, "It seems that we now have a chance to cooperate?" According to the intelligence coming from before, Loki, who calls himself God, has shown great strength. Able to control people's hearts with ease, even the agents of SHIELD are completely unable to resist it. Rogers didn't know yet that what they called the hypercube was the container for the space stone, the Tesseract. Moreover, Loki's intention to steal the Tesseract is to open space teleportation. Teleport the Chitauri army to Earth. If he had known that, I'm afraid Rogers wouldn't be able to laugh anymore. However, to Luya, the Chitauri army is nothing. Being able to be killed by normal firearms would not be taken seriously by the current Luya. The really tricky thing is that Loki originally. Let's not talk about Thanos. With Odin sitting in the 9 realms, it is not possible for him to come to the Earth in person for the time being. But Loki alone is already quite powerful. Originally, his strength was not weak, and he had the Mind Stone. If you step forward rashly, you might end up falling into the hands of Loki. Whether it's the man of the motherland or Superman's steel body, his magic resistance ability is relatively weak. Luya doesn't think he can resist the control of the Mind Stone. Trouble. In the communicator, Stark felt Luya's emotions and asked quickly. "Lua, what's wrong?" Then, he said as if he had thought of something. "Speak." That Thor said that Loki was his brother. Thor is so weak, I guess his brother can't be much stronger, right? After Stark finished speaking, Luya felt as if he heard the protest coming from Thor. Of course, this is not the point. Luya reminded in a serious voice. Tony, listen. Never approach Loki casually, it's best to stay away from him. This guy is very strong, I have to think about it. Hearing Luya's serious reminder, Stark's voice became serious. Are you actually not sure about it? I understand, I won't take the initiative to approach him. Episode 74. Sir, Loki is about to arrive. Stark hung up the phone with a serious expression. Beside him, Little Pepper looked at her boyfriend with some confusion. Tony, what's wrong? Stark didn't hide the alien invasion from her. Although I am surprised that Loki, the legendary god of trickery, really exists. However, Stark's initial confidence still infected Pepper, making her less worried. However, after making a phone call to Luya, her boyfriend's expression became so serious. It's like the world is going to end tomorrow. The last time I saw this expression was because of palladium poisoning. It's trouble. Stark didn't hide anything and told his girlfriend Chili Pepper about Luya's reminder. Is that so? But even if Luya can't help it, I believe you have the ability to protect everyone. Pepper knew that Stark would never let anything happen to Earth. However, this time, Stark, who had always been confident, shook his head. The opponent is not a good person, and Luya said that even he is not sure of winning. Stark tugged at a small patch of his beard anxiously. He simply couldn't believe that there were people in this world whom Luya didn't have the confidence to deal with. At this time, behind him, a man with slovenly clothes and blonde hair walked out. What? Did you just talk about Loki? My brother also came to Midgard? Thor looked very excited. Of course, if you ignore the beer in his hand and the meat residue on his mouth. Stark glanced at him helplessly. Do you really think you are Thor? To be honest, Thor's words make it difficult for Stark to believe that this guy who eats junk food all day long can actually be that Loki's brother. This strength is too unequal. Today's Thor, it's not Stark who looks down on him. After wearing Mark 6, you can definitely beat him. Thor looked at Stark's slightly contemptuous eyes and suddenly felt that he had been greatly insulted. What's that look in your eyes, Tony? He protested loudly. I'm just temporarily blocked from my divine power. If I can pick up Meow Meow, there is no way you can be my opponent. Sol tried his best to prove himself and his strength. However, what they got in exchange were pity looks from Stark and Pepper. Okay, you are awesome, okay? Stark replied perfunctorily. However, Sol was not angry at this. Let me go. I'll go talk to Loki and make it clear. Although Thor was angry about the treatment he received in Midgard. But after living here for this period of time, he also developed some feelings for the Earth. Especially, the female physicist Jane Foster came to see me before. Coupled with Stark's shelter and Luya's mutual acquaintance. Thor also has a preliminary bond on Earth. Moreover, in Thor's eyes, Father Odin patrols the 9 realms, and Midgard is also one of their gods' territories. Now his younger brother Loki actually wants to open the door to space and help the Chitauri army invade. This kind of behavior is simply inviting the wolf into the house. However, at this time, Thor still thought that his brother might just be confused by someone. As long as you persuade him personally, you will definitely be able to make him return from his lost ways. Stark did not refuse Thor's proposal. Although I really don't want to believe that Thor is Loki's brother outside. But Luya confirmed Thor's identity here, and it was indeed Thor who was right. Sky Carrier. Fury listened to Phil Coulson's report with a serious expression. In other words, Barton is now controlled by that Loki? Patton, or Hawkeye. As a marksman, his surrender made Fury quite uneasy. In particular, due to the lore during this period, Iron Man, a powerful force, did not join the Avengers. This made Fury even more unsure. Fortunately, he turned to look at Banner. At least I still have Hulk. Hulk's power increases with anger. Although Banner will be suppressed by Hulk's personality, Fury is not reluctant to use Hulk to deal with Loki in an emergency. At this time, due to the betrayal of Hawkeye and others, Fury and others now boarded the Sky aircraft carrier in advance. Stark building. Stark once again received information from Fury. You mean, this guy went to steal the iridium element? On the virtual projection screen, Fury's voice came. Yes, he controlled Dr. Sever while he was hosting a banquet. The only thing that puzzles me is why he wants to snatch the iridium element. Is this thing useful? After listening to Fury's description, Stark's mind immediately recalled the relevant knowledge. Stabilizer. This element acts as a stabilizer. Lewis said that Loki wants to use the Tesseract to open the space portal. Perhaps he is preparing for this. While the two were chatting, Jarvis's voice suddenly interrupted them. Gentlemen. The person you highlighted, Loki, has been detected and is heading here. Estimated time, arriving in 1 minute. Stark has marked Loki's name as a priority. Therefore, Jarvis will test him whenever he appears in a monitored place. However, due to Loki's elusiveness before. Therefore, it was not until he was approaching the Stark building that Jarvis discovered him from the surveillance camera at the intersection and reported it in time. Sir, I suggest you move as soon as possible. Finally, Jarvis did not forget to remind him. Tony, what happened to you over there? Fury faintly heard Jarvis's voice on the other end of the call, so he hurriedly asked. Trouble, that guy came to my place. As the tallest building in the vicinity, it seems not surprising that the Stark building was chosen by Loki as the base to open the space portal. OFA. Tony, leave now. Never be controlled by Loki's scepter. At the same time, Jarvis spoke up again. Sir, please hurry up and leave. However, Stark just glanced at his girlfriend and then gave an order to Jarvis. Find the best exit route for Pepper. With that said, Stark forcefully held down Pepper, who wanted to stay. Someone has to stay here and stall for time. You don't want me to be distracted by you at this time, right? His words were very clear, he just wanted to stay and delay time. Although little Pepper was sad about this, she still knew that staying here was just a drag. On the contrary, Soul, who was standing aside, still said carelessly. Don't worry, I don't understand my brother yet. I will persuade him. Episode 75. The plan succeeded. Ignore Thor. Stark picked up a bracelet from the nearby workbench. This is the locator for Mark 7. Although the research and development has not been completed yet, he can no longer care about that much now. Soon, Loki arrived at Stark Tower. And he also discovered his brother, Thor. Loki showed an evil smile. Brother, long time no see. He knew that the old man temporarily banned his magical power in order to test his brother. In other words, Thor is not in any danger at this time. As for Stark standing next to Thor, he was completely ignored by him. Since arriving on Earth, Loki has not encountered any decent resistance. Therefore, he now looks down upon Earth civilization. Younger brother. Thor looked at Loki with a complicated expression. Why do you do this? Destroying Midgard doesn't mean anything. However, Thor's words not only failed to impress Loki, but instead angered him. Younger brother? Thor, do you really think of me as your brother? Speaking of which, I am the son of Odin. But I know. At this time, Loki looked a little crazy, and a little sad. I am a descendant of the giants of Jotunheim, I am not an Asgardian at all. You have never regarded me as one of your own. You are like this, and so is the old man. Loki became more and more excited as he spoke, and kept waving the strange-looking scepter in his hand. Stark narrowed his eyes. Is this the scepter that can control people's hearts? In fact, there was nothing special about the Chitauri scepter originally. What can really control people's hearts is actually the soul gem embedded in it. Thor was quite shocked when faced with Loki's roar, and he opened his mouth to comfort him. Younger brother. Father and I have always treated you as a family, right? Whether you are from the giants of Jotunheim or not, this will not change. Facing Thor's innocent speech, Loki laughed even harder. So what? I have done so many things over the years to get the old man's approval. Am I not worthy to be the heir to Asgard? But the old man would rather ban your divine power to sharpen you than pass the throne of Asgard to me. Loki could see clearly that the old man just wanted to assist Thor himself. From beginning to end, no matter how hard you try. It doesn't matter what's wrong with Soul here or there. From beginning to end, I have never appeared on the list of heirs. Therefore, I just want to prove it to the old man. His vision is not good at all. Thinking of this, Loki became increasingly annoyed and grabbed Thor's clothes and lifted him up. Hey! Loki! What do you want to do? I'm your brother. Now, even Thor was angry. Just don't mention that Loki now has 2 Infinity Stones. Loki's pure strength is not comparable to that of himself, who has been banned from divine power. At this time, Loki didn't want to talk to his brother Thor anymore. You can just watch the destruction of Midgard with peace of mind. After that, he exerted force on his arm, and Soul smashed the glass of the building like a cannonball and fell downstairs. Thor. Stark's heart skipped a beat and he wanted to catch up. Ant. Loki glanced at Stark contemptuously, smashed his right arm, and knocked Stark to the ground. Thor is the name that you, a mortal, can call directly? Loki is actually quite conflicted. On the one hand, he was very dissatisfied that his idiot brother could be valued by the old man. On the other hand, he couldn't let go of the emotions he had experienced for so many years. The reason why I want to help Thanos this time. On the one hand, it is for the Chitauri scepter in Thanos' hands. On the other hand, it is also to express his dissatisfaction to Odin. As for mortals like Stark, he really doesn't like them at the moment. But I can give you a chance to be my slave. With that said, Loki showed his standard evil smile again. He. Brother, just watch. As he spoke, he gently tapped the Chitauri scepter on Stark's chest. Don't you want to protect your Earth? Loki has controlled many people before using the Chitauri scepter. He is going to do the same to Stark and let the man who protects his home become the murderer of his home. He knew that people from Midgard were already on their way to stop him. So, he sneered and said, "Go and stop your compatriots, don't let them come near here." The yellow mind stone seemed to sparkle in the sunlight. Stark looked at Loki, who was talking to himself, with a mocking look on his face. "It seems that your scepter is not that effective? What's going on?" Loki glanced at the Chitauri scepter in his hand with a confused expression. After coming to Midgard, this was the first time he failed. But it makes no sense. How could a mere mortal resist the control of the Chitauri scepter? At this time, Loki did not yet know the true value of the Chitauri scepter. He thought it was just a powerful staff given to him by Thanos. After realizing that there might be something wrong with the staff, he angrily threw the staff to the ground. Bang! The Chitauri staff turned over on the ground for a while, and finally stopped next to the broken floor-to-ceiling window. In contrast, Stark thought about it and prepared to add the last fire. You know, sexual dysfunction is not uncommon. After all, every fifth man. Before he finished speaking, Stark felt himself rising into the air. Looking at Stark falling rapidly from the building, Loki withdrew his gaze. Listening to the howling of the wind in his ears, Stark clicked on the bracelet. After scanning, Jarvis's voice came. Mark 7 has been released from the warehouse. Bang! Leg armor, chest armor, arm armor, helmet and other parts flew out of the Stark building one after another, covering Stark's body. Bring it on! Stark's eyes are determined as he prepares for his first actual battle with the Mark 7. However, seeing the ground getting closer and closer, a desperate voice appeared in the back of his head. After a sound of metal colliding, Stark turned his head with difficulty. Due to incomplete technology, various parts of the Mark 7 collided into a ball and lost power one after another. There was a moment of silence, and Stark's mouth moved with difficulty in the strong wind. Yeah. Bang. 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 Several consecutive blasts of wind came, and Stark felt the world spin for a while, and he was entangled in a large amount of black, spider silk. Looking up, a black figure appeared in front of him. "Hello, Mr. Stark." Peter waved awkwardly. Episode 76. Unlock, Heat Vision. From the top of the Stark building, huge amounts of blue light rose into the sky. Soon, a big hole opened in the sky, a door to space. In the black hole is a huge biological mothership of huge amounts that could never be an Earth ship. In the deep starry sky, the mothership is reflected strangely and gorgeously. Loki smiled as he watched the Karita legions emerging from the space gate one after another. Chitauri scepter? Nice one. A voice came from behind him. Loki looked back and saw an Earthling who looked very much like his brother. Looking at the scepter in Luya's hand, Loki shrugged. First of all, I hate blonde idiots. Second, give me back my scepter. Since arriving on Earth, he has not encountered any decent resistance. Therefore, at this time, Loki did not take the indigenous people here seriously, including Luya. It was naturally impossible for Luya to return the Chitauri scepter to him. Instead, look at the yellow gem inlaid on the top of the scepter. Luya stretched out 3 fingers and twisted them hard. Click. Is this the legendary Mind Stone? One of the 6 infinity stones in the universe. The moment Luya's hand came into contact with it, invisibly, strands of yellow light continued to enter his body from the mind gem along his palm. Interesting. Luya can feel that the power contained in this gem can destroy the entire Earth in an instant. Of course, this is completely normal. As long as you can skillfully use an infinite gem, you can at least reach the level of Heavenly Father level combat power. Once the 6 gems are gathered together, the power of destruction and creation will be at the minimum level of a single universe. Superman template. Superman template unlocking degree. Superman, Man of Steel, template unlocking degree 40%. Luya could feel that the Mind Stone was inputting some kind of energy into his body at an extremely fast speed. This energy appears to be very similar to yellow solar radiation. In just a few seconds, the unlock level of Superman reached 40. At this time, Luya only felt his eyes numb, and a more burning and destructive energy gathered in front of his eyes. Turning to look at Loki, Luya felt the killing intent in his heart rising uncontrollably. Wow. 2 red rays of light shot out and swept across in the horizontal direction at the same time. Wherever the red light passed, it left bursts of invisible fluctuations in the air. And this floor of the building was also cut off. A large amount of glass, furniture, etc. turned into liquid and ashes, and then evaporated and dispersed. Whoosh! A green phantom flashed, and Loki revealed his figure. Voodoo. Looking at the damage caused by the lure, he swallowed hard. What kind of destructive power is this? Loki clearly saw that the two red rays of light completely disappeared after cutting for thousands of meters. In the air, among the Chitauri army that had just descended, many unlucky ones had not yet had time to cause any damage. It was cut in half by the residual power of the red light. Suddenly, it was like dumplings falling from the sky. A large number of grotesque corpses and biological flying chariots fell to the ground. The red light in his eyes dissipated, and Luya let out a sigh of relief. Is this the power of heat vision? 40% unlocking level, Superman template heat vision unlocked. After a long absence, Luya felt weak. The reason why the heat vision just now was so powerful was that it could spread thousands of meters. It is also caused by Luya's overdraft of energy. For some reason, the Superman, Man of Steel, template was raised to 40% just now, after unlocking the heat vision. A violent emotion appeared in Luya's heart, so he used his heat vision overload. After looking at the shocked Loki, Luya lowered his head and looked at the mind stone in his hand. Is it affecting my mind? Luya's brain was spinning rapidly. The 40% unlocking degree has already given him the prototype of a super brain. Soon, Luya came to a conclusion. My current planet-level power is still a bit reluctant when using infinite gems. Especially the soul gem. Once you rely too much on its power, your own sanity will be affected. Just like now. Luya uncontrollably showed murderous intent towards Loki. This horse is from Earth? Loki's back felt cold when Luya saw him, and he was about to use magic to teleport himself out of here. It would be shameful to run away from a mortal without a fight, but Loki was not his brother Thor. If it were Thor, he might still fight for the pride in his heart. Now Loki is the god of trickery and will only consider the best course of action. Aiming at the lure with his left hand, Loki muttered something. He has very high attainments in magic, and wants to use magic to hold Luya down first, and then teleport it safely. However, it only takes a blink of an eye. Loki was horrified to find that he had lost the figure of Luya. Damn it. Before he had time to think, a mini portal opened and Loki jumped back. In less than a second, the portal closed directly. At the moment before closing, Loki seemed to hear huge amounts of sonic booms outside. On the streets, a large number of police cars were dispatched, including SHIELD agents. At this time, they were all blocking the Chitauri army that was constantly appearing in the sky. Who is that? Peter? Go and help civilians catch the wreckage of the aircraft falling from the sky. Stark ordered everyone present one by one. He knows the identity of Spider-Man who saved him. Peter, Luya's younger brother. Although it is different from what I remember wearing the red suit. Peter's Spider-Man suit today is black. But Stark still analyzed it through Jarvis. Okay, Mr. Stark. Peter couldn't care less how Stark knew his name, and black cobwebs kept shooting out. Intercept the debris falling from the sky one by one. He was a little confused. Usually when encountering such dangerous things, besides myself, Gwen would also be present. But why didn't I see her today? What's more important is that brother Luya is not here. Peter doesn't think his brother Luya is afraid of these alien creatures. After all, he knew the force he used when he beat him. In fact, Gwen is in Hell's Kitchen at this time. Luya doesn't pay attention to the Chitauri army for the time being. As long as the planet-level strength of Loki is solved, the Chitauri are actually better to solve. Therefore, Gwen maintained order in various streets at this time. After all, there are a lot of people who want to take advantage of the chaos to cause damage and gain benefits. In the sky, huge amounts of Chitauri beasts began to fall. However, Avenger support has also arrived. Hulk! Banner roared, and his whole body instantly swelled and turned green. Episode 77. While you are still the god of trickery. Hulk! Huge amounts of bodies appear on the scene. The violent power began to show, and even the Chitauri behemoth could be destroyed with just one punch. In terms of physical strength, Hulk really crushes everyone. Even Peter, who has the blessing of shadow poison, is far behind. What an evil force. On Peter's shoulder, a black head poked out. Staring at Hulk's back, it expressed such emotion. Because it begged for mercy in time, Luya did not use Cyclops to kill it completely. Of course, it's unclear whether the elder brother's consideration for increasing his younger brother Peter's growth is involved. Peter does know Hulk, after all, he witnessed his brother Luya beating Hulk and hate alone. At the same time, after he returned, he also studied it specially. Didn't he have a genetic mutation caused by some kind of radiation? And Peter glanced at Shadow Poison. This guy actually has the nerve to call others evil. You obviously look more like a villain yourself. Seeing that Peter didn't believe it, Shadow didn't say much. After all, it's just a vague feeling, and it's not really sure where Hulk's power comes from. On the roadside, Hawkeye and others joined Captain America as he was out of control. The tense situation eased some. On the side, Thor was constantly picking up gravel from the ground and throwing it at the flying chariot overhead. Although he has no divine power, his physical body is still much stronger than ordinary people. Therefore, he was thrown from a tall building by his younger brother Loki, but he did not suffer any harm. Asgard. Looking at the chaotic Midgard, there was no fluctuation in Odin's one eye. First, he knew that Midgard seemed to be all mortals, but in fact the water was very deep. Not to mention lures, as long as the magicians of Kamatage join the battle, it will be enough for these Chitauri to eat a pot. As for Loki's nonsense behavior, he only regarded it as his son's rebellious behavior. What he really cares about is Thanos, who is collecting infinite stones deep in the universe. Although he is a heavenly father, he has reached this age, the end of his lifespan and the growing magic power in his body, so he has to find time to fall into deep sleep as soon as possible. It is also called Odin sleep. However, this is just a drop in the bucket. When the deadline comes, even a powerful heavenly father like Odin will have no way to escape. This was also the real reason why he didn't help Midgard. Even if there is no Luya, he will not help directly. If even the Chitauri army summoned by Loki cannot resist, then the destruction of Midgard's life may be an inevitable result. Because Thanos is much more cold-blooded in exterminating the creatures in the universe. When looking at his son Thor, Odin couldn't help but smile a little. At least, he can fight bravely without divine power or Mjolnir. Moreover, it seems that the problem of arrogance has also been improved. Thor, you passed the test. Odin's voice drifted away. Earth. One shot killed the Karita man on the flying chariot, and Rogers threw the shield smoothly. The amazing arm strength caused the shield to make a whistling sound and fly hundreds of meters into the air. After killing more than a dozen Karitas, the shield flew back into Rogers' hands as if it was programmed. It's different from how it was in the movie at the beginning. The Captain America who can forcefully fight Thanos 50-50. It's definitely not just a guy who has to use a shield to absorb the shock and take a breath after jumping from a tall building. Ever since he woke up from the ice, Rogers could feel it. My body is recovering day by day, and is even constantly surpassing its peak. He is actually practicing controlling his strength on weekdays. Otherwise, every time you pick up something, you will either crush it or slap it with too much force and it will fly out. At this time, a transparent halo appeared in front of him. Then, the mini portal opened. Loki walked out with lingering fear. He was too scared when he faced the disappearing Luya just now. Therefore, there was no time to cast the spell for too long, and the space teleportation only went a short distance. But before he could breathe a sigh of relief, a chill appeared behind him. He's behind me. Loki could feel the strong killing intent coming from behind him. However, just because you can feel it doesn't mean you can avoid it. Loki's head turned back with difficulty, his eyes trying to find the lure. However, the huge roar in the distance is getting closer and closer. It only takes 3 times Mach and the lure has arrived behind Loki. Let me see how much God weighs. Luya punched out. Nearly 20,000 tons of power exploded at one point. Even if Loki is a descendant of the giants of Jotunheim, even if he is the god of trickery, this punch will at least result in serious injury. Younger brother. At the critical moment, a hammer wrapped in lightning flew out. Mjolnir is quite powerful, and Luya doesn't want to take the risk of injury. Therefore, he could only change direction. Clang. The sound of huge amounts of metal collision sounded, and Luya's body floating off the ground swayed back. Shaking his right hand, the remaining thunder and lightning on it immediately dissipated. Correspondingly, Mjolnir was directly knocked underneath by Luya's punch. Huge amounts of impact caused a large explosion in place. Huge amounts of sound directly attracted the attention of everyone present. Well, are you guys having an internal fight? Natasha Romanoff, the Black Widow, looked at Stark with some confusion. Originally, the field should be divided into 2 camps. The Chitauri army and the people of Earth. At most, we can subdivide the Avengers and Stark teams. And Thor was originally from Stark's side. Now, it seems that he and Luya have a conflict and are standing together. Luya, he is my brother. Thor stood in front of Loki, stretched out his hand, and Mjolnir returned to his hand. Generally speaking, the power of Thor's hammer can show a crushing attitude when faced with those under the sub-heavenly father level. After all, it was enchanted by Odin. It's just that Luya has also been recognized by Mjolnir. Therefore, Thor's hammer does not cause much damage to the lure. There was a faint red light in his eyes, and Luya's body slowly rose upwards. Thor, look around. Can Loki's mistakes be erased with just a word from your brother? Although the invasion of the Chitauri army did not cause too many casualties, it caused real damage to the nearby areas. Moreover, in addition to this, Luya actually also has his own selfish motives. I won't torture you while you are still the god of trickery. When you become the god of stories, there will be no chance. Episode 78. My brother? Luya expressed sympathy for what happened to Loki in the future, but the mistakes he made at this moment were real. What if Stark took the risk and let Loki throw away the scepter? Even Luya himself would not dare to approach easily. In the soul gem, there is still energy flowing into Luya's body. The ability that was consumed by using heat vision was quickly replenished. After listening to Luya's accusation, Sol, who had recovered his divine power, looked at his brother and then around. Of course he knew that his brother had caused a big disaster this time. Summoning foreign enemies to deal with Midgard is beyond the scope of tolerance. However, Sol is a very emotional guy. Looking at Stark and others who were still blocking the Chitauri army, Thor gritted his teeth and said, My brother, I will report to my father when I return and punish him. In Thor's view, even if his brother made a mistake, he is still his brother, the son of the god King Odin. How is it possible for him to be judged by others? Behind Thor, Loki saw that his brother Thor was willing to risk everything to help him speak, and he was deeply moved. However, when he thought of his father Odin's unfair treatment and his own rough life experience, his eyes dimmed again. If you say so. Luya nodded and agreed. If it were him, even if his family made a mistake, they wouldn't be able to let others deal with it. However, this does not mean that Luya is willing to let Loki go so easily. Including Sol. Although the two of them have now learned a little bit of humility due to their own strength. But the pride engraved in the bones of Asgard people has not been completely erased. This is not good, this is not good. Maybe one day in the future, I will still need their help. Therefore, Luya was determined to convince the two brothers before they grew up. As for the best way to subdue the proud Thor and Loki, there is nothing better than a beating. Think about it in the movie, when Loki was thrown repeatedly by Hulk for the first time, he would still be frightened when he met Hulk after that. As for the damage caused in New York because of Loki, in fact, this reason is the most trivial in Luya. As long as family and friends are not harmed, everything else is fine. Loki was a threat to Stark, so Luya had to punish him no matter what. Thinking of this, the corners of Luya's mouth raised, his eyes flashed red, and he looked at Loki behind Thor. What? Feeling the murderous intent in Luya's eyes, Loki felt the chill in his back rise straight up. Even hiding behind his brother Sol didn't make him feel safe at all. However, the pride of the Asgardians and the status of giants of Jotunheim could not allow him to show weakness in front of a mortal. So, he could only look to one side with a nonchalant expression, pretending to be careless. Then, he casually muttered to his brother Thor. Who wants you to help me? Hearing his brother's words, Thor's hand holding the hammer trembled slightly. He didn't understand why his brother, who once fought alongside him, suddenly seemed like a different person. But even so, he still did not move away from his brother. He knows the strength of Luya better than Loki. During this time on Earth, Thor didn't indulge in drinking beer, eating junk food, and playing games every day. At least, not all the time. During this period of following Stark, he still learned something. For example, Stark also asked Jarvis to roughly estimate the combat effectiveness of the lure through the video of the lure's public battle. The result obtained is speeds exceeding Mach 12. The power exceeds 10,000 tons. The body's ability to withstand it is extremely strong, so we can't draw an accurate conclusion yet. Preliminary estimates are that it can withstand nuclear bombs, hydrogen bombs, and other weapons of great destruction. Come to conclusion. It crushes humans in all aspects and is almost invulnerable to human weapons. The reason for this conclusion is the result of Luya superimposing two templates. And Jarvis also reminded. It is detected that the target's strength is still increasing rapidly, so the evaluation is only effective currently. Sol also knows these Jarvis's comments about Luya. Stark may not know what this means, but he just feels that Luya is indeed powerful. But as an Asgardian, Thor has a clearer understanding of strength levels. In terms of Luya's previous performance, it is already a planet-level top existence. Not to mention, his strength is still improving at a rapid rate. For example, the destructive ray emitted from Luya's eyes just now is obviously much more powerful than the laser light at the beginning. Fortunately, it is indeed difficult to reach a Tianfu through the superposition of pure strength values. Therefore, Sol can still have the courage to stand in front of Luya at this time. Otherwise, he would have called his father, the god King Odin. Besides, he and his brother are both planet level, so together, they may not be afraid of Luya. It seems. After a while, Sol's confidence in facing Luya increased. He turned to look at his brother Loki. Don't be afraid, Loki? Thor turned his head and looked, and his brother Loki was nowhere to be seen. When? Cold sweat fell from his forehead. Now, Sol is really breaking out in a cold sweat. Loki. Thor couldn't believe that when he stood in front of his brother actually abandoned him and ran away alone. Looking back, Sol glanced at the lure. Seeing that the red light in Luya's eyes still hadn't dissipated, he felt his scalp starting to feel numb. How about this, do you still want to defend such a younger brother? Luya opened his mouth and taunted. However, he could actually perceive that Loki did not leave. As the god of trickery, Loki has considerable magical attainments. The reason why he was able to disappear under his nose was that Luya guessed that he must have used some kind of blinding magic. On Sol's side, although his younger brother ran away, he had no intention of escaping. As a brother, I will definitely bear the responsibility for the mistakes he made. I have to say that Sol's pride is sometimes also his cuteness. Since you said so. Before he finished speaking, Luya also disappeared in front of Sol. Woohoo! A sharp roar echoed in place, and an afterimage stretched from the ground to the sky. As for the Chitauri army in the sky, as long as it blocked the flight path of the lure, they all exploded into red mist. Coming. Sol's perception told him that the Luya's attack was right above his head. Hoo ho ho. His right hand turned Mjolnir rapidly. The ground cracked layer by layer under Thor's countershock force. At a certain limit, the hammer soared into the sky with countless blue-white electric currents. Thor gritted his teeth and... Bring it on! Episode 79. Explosive Fall. A whistling sound came over Thor's head. He knew that although he could see Luya's figure clearly, he could not react to his body movements. So, just wave Mjolnir in advance. Thor's decision was right. When his Thor's hammer had just passed his head, Luya's fist had already arrived. Boom! With the two people at the center, the violent storm spread to all directions. The impact of fists and hammers shocked the hearts of everyone on the field. Ugh! Natasha Romanoff, Hawkeye and the others, who were mortals, covered their hearts and groaned. Immediately, an indescribable uncomfortable feeling appeared in my chest. This is the result of Luya deliberately controlling the shock wave to avoid them. Pushing away the Chitauri who fell in front of him and lost his breath. Seeing the strange colored blood flowing out of its mouth and nose, Natasha Romanoff had a look of shock on her face. Turning his head to look in the direction of Luya and Sol, the two of them were completely covered by a large amount of smoke and dust. Is just a scattered shock wave so powerful? Is this the power of gods? As an agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., Natasha Romanoff certainly knows that Thor calls himself Thor. It is the god who controls thunder and lightning in the legendary Nordic mythology. So, what kind of existence should a Luya be that can fight with Thor or even suppress Thor? Natasha Romanoff never had a clear understanding of the power of lures. But today, she finally saw it. Of course, Stark was also shocked. He didn't expect that Thor only drank beer, played games, and loved to eat junk food all day long. He actually has such a powerful power. Yes, if Stark were to replace himself, I'm afraid he wouldn't even have the confidence to punch the lure. Thinking of this, he lowered his head with some inexplicable disappointment. Now that the world has lures, does it still need Iron Man? As Luya's friend, he knows how rapidly Luya's strength has improved. Through Jarvis's analysis, the power of Luya is clearly only about 10,000 tons. However, the conclusion given by Jarvis at this time was that it had exceeded 20,000 tons. Moreover, this power may not be the limit of Luya. At this moment, in front of the crazy power of Luya, Stark fell into confusion. He began to doubt himself. I have always been keen on enjoying myself, pursuing fame and fortune, and being surrounded by people's praise. Iron Man. Perhaps, in the eyes of gods, he is just an ant. It's just that Luya's strength is too strong, and it's too unlike a human being. He didn't know that his appearance today directly made Stark suspicious of life. In the center of the battlefield, the dust gradually dispersed, revealing the fighting situation inside. The lure floated half a meter above the ground, its body bathed in thunder and lightning. However, this level of lightning did not have any impact on the lure. On the ground, the originally smooth streets have disappeared. Instead, there was a huge pit. Brown soil was splashing everywhere, and in the center of the pit, a figure was half kneeling. Standing up with difficulty, Sol held on to his trembling right arm. He could feel that the lure finally gave up its strength. Otherwise, if a full 20,000 tons of power pours down, I will not be able to bear it. But even so, Sol's current condition is not very good. The ability to resist beating is good. Luya gave an evaluation. It's just good. With just this punch, Thor basically lost the ability to fight again. If he hadn't been the owner of Thor's hammer, he wouldn't be able to hold it now. Somewhere where the smoke and dust dispersed, the air became distorted. Call. A figure in green armor gradually appears. The first thing that appeared was an arm. Loki's left hand exudes huge magic power, and a magic ball is rapidly forming. The door to space opened, and he instantly appeared behind Luya. Etc. Thor watched his brother appear and hurriedly stopped him. He knew Luya's physical defense, so he believed that his magic resistance was also quite high. After all, normal strong people develop in a balanced way. Therefore, he is afraid of his brother Loki's attack and angers Luya again. However, Loki obviously would not miss this opportunity for a sneak attack. He talks about his dissatisfaction with his adoptive father Odin and his brother Thor. But after seeing his brother hurt by him, he still couldn't resist his impulse and showed up to attack the lure. Feeling the magic power fluctuations coming from behind, Luya could feel the danger brought to him from above. The skin on your back is quickly warning you of danger. I also know that Loki, as a planet-level powerhouse who uses magic, is actually quite restrained by the current lures at this point. Whether it is the current Patriot template or the Superman, Man of Steel, template, magic resistance is his relative weakness. But Luya's figure flashed. Only laughter was left echoing in place. What's the use of having strong magic? What does it matter if the magic resistance is not enough? Although Loki can pose a certain threat to himself, his speed is a flaw. No warrior would just stay in place and receive the magician's attack. When Loki blinked again, the lure in front of him disappeared. The magic ball, exuding a cutting aura in his hand, lost its target. His back was instantly wet with cold sweat. Later. Thor's voice sounded again. But this time, it was his brother who reminded him. Loki reacted in an instant, and the magic ball in his left hand dispersed. At the same time, the right hand activates the magic to open the miniature portal again. However, his right hand had just been raised. Suddenly, a big hand appeared from behind and grabbed his arm. Got you. Luya grinned, not giving Loki a chance to react. The arm suddenly exerts force. For a moment, Loki felt dizzy, and everything around him began to rotate. The magic power in the hand was forcibly disconnected, and then he saw the ground very close at hand. Boom. A loud bang. Loki hit the ground face first, then his whole body. Then, the Lua disappeared again from in front of Loki, and then appeared at his feet. No. Loki's pupils shrank. At this moment, he wanted to beg for mercy. But it was too late, Luya didn't give him this chance at all. Grabbing Loki's ankle. Boom. 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 Dong 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 dong. The intensive sound resounded throughout the street. Everything around is shaking. Poor Loki. He escaped Hulk's slam, but met a more brutal lure. Episode 80. Mind, space. How dare you? At first, Loki wanted to say a few harsh words towards Luya. However, when Luya saw that he could still speak, he directly increased the strength of his arms. Because the speed was too fast, there were bursts of whistling sounds in the air. And Loki's shouting, or perhaps wailing, was directly covered up in it. Of course, Luya did not kill him. Moreover, a physical attack of this level would not kill Loki, a demigod with giants of Jotunheim. At most, it's just blue and purple, which is uncomfortable. In the pit, Thor successfully jumped to the ground with the help of Mjolnir. Looking at his suffering brother, he fell silent. Maybe it would be better to let Luya vent his anger. Soon, Luya felt that Loki's eyes began to blur in his hand. Boom. For the last time, Loki lay peacefully on the ground. Around him, the ground seemed to have been plowed dozens of times. That's it for today. Luya glanced at the sky, and saw that the Chitauri army was still pouring out of the space gate. Next time it won't be as simple as throwing two. If we don't close the door to space, there is no way to stop the invasion of this group of alien civilizations. I understand what you are saying, but the question is how to close it. Who should close it? Use nuclear bombs to destroy their mothership directly. Agree. Beep. Lua, think of a way. Stark's voice was urgent. As time goes by, the Chitauri army grows larger and larger, seemingly endless. The ammunition of his steel suit is not unlimited, and the outer armor has been severely damaged. I glanced at the roof of the Stark building, where there was still a beam of light reaching into the sky. Wait. As soon as he finished speaking, Luya's figure slowly disappeared. The next second, he appeared on the roof of the building. Looking at the tesseract exuding endless power, even Luya's heartbeat accelerated slightly at this time. Compared to the Mind Stone, the Space Stone is much more expressive at this time. The red light in both eyes converges, and the heat vision is emitted in one go. The energy-gathering device was completely destroyed, and the tesseract finally stopped transmitting energy and turned back into a cube and fell to the ground. However, although the connection between the tesseract and the space gate in the sky was cut off, the passage was not closed directly, but closed slowly. If you want to completely solve it, you still have to destroy the mothership of the Chitauri army. At this time, Stark's voice came from the communicator again. Lua, I can transport nuclear bombs into the space gate. Wish me luck. Luya released his supervision and directly locked onto Stark in the distance. I saw him carrying a half-body-long nuclear warhead on his back, flying straight towards the door of space. It's just that his flying speed seems a bit too slow. Luya floated in the air, just watching quietly without speaking. Okay. Finally, Stark was the first to take it anymore. If there were no Luya, he would fly into the space gate with a nuclear bomb without hesitation. However, now that he has Luya, he doesn't want to die. He knew that Luya's speed was much faster than his own. And more importantly, through Jarvis's analysis, Luya is not afraid of nuclear bomb explosions at all. Luya, you don't want to watch your friend die, right? Stark smiled bitterly. Suddenly, he felt a lightness behind his back. Turning around to look, the nuclear warhead was already in Luya's hands. Be careful, the door to space is about to close. Without saying much, Luya turned into a shadow and flew to the door of space. Beyond the door are huge amounts of Chitauri mothership. The 40% unlocking level of Superman, Man of Steel, gives Luya a brain far beyond that of ordinary people. After calculating the route in 1 second, Luya exerted force on his arm and directly threw the nuclear warhead in his hand towards the mothership. I will not risk entering unknown space now. After all, if an accident occurs and I am trapped somewhere in the universe, it will be troublesome. In his eyes, heat gathered again. This time, the 2 red dots solidified in front of his eyes. In the mind gem, more energy began to radiate. Phew! Thousands of meters passed by in a flash. Following the explosion of the nuclear bomb, 2 red light beams took the lead in cutting up the Chitauri mothership. Before the space door closed, the last sight before Luya's eyes was endless explosions. Some of the Chitauri flying tanks and other vehicles still remaining on the Earth lost contact with the mothership and suddenly lost all power. Stark's office. With the portal to space closed, the Chitauri invasion ended. At this time, Loki was standing behind Thor, with his hands cuffed and a miserable look on his face. I'm sorry for causing so much trouble to everyone. Saul apologized sincerely. The younger brother made a mistake, and he believed that he, as the older brother, was also responsible. Of course, cuffing his brother Loki's hands was also done for everyone present, especially Luya. Said that Loki would be punished after returning. However, Luya sat on the sofa and didn't pay much attention. He was playing with a yellow gem and a dim cube. This was his biggest gain from this incident. Needless to say, the mind gem has energy rays, can control the mind, provide energy, create intelligent life, etc. Among them, the most useful one is probably to provide energy. Because Luya doesn't know magic at all, and his strength is not enough. After trying to use the energy rays emitted by the Mind Stone, he found that it was not as good as his own heat vision. As for creating intelligent life, Luya glanced at Stark, who was sitting with Pepper, enjoying some quiet time. Now that the Mind Stone is in his hands, Ultron may not appear. This also means that vision will not be created. If Luya can only use the Mind Stone initially, he has no clue about the Space Stone. At this time, the Space Stone is still contained in the Tesseract. Apart from violent destruction, like Thanos crushing the Tesseract to remove the Space Stone, Luya has no other way to remove it. And once the Tesseract is crushed, there will be a super burst of energy. Luya is still not sure whether he can withstand this energy. After all, it is the power of the 6 laws of the universe. Luya feels that it is better to be cautious about it. What happened now is that everyone no longer holds the younger brother Loki accountable for his fault. Sol then proposed to leave. After regaining his divine power, his mission in coming to Midgard has actually been completed.